Two people. One earns $40,000 a year. The other earns 140. The one earning 140 is the broke one. Here's the claim I'm going to defend. Staying broke has almost nothing to do with how much you make. There is a specific calculable point. $140,000 a year sounds like safety, but watch where it goes. A mortgage stretched to the edge of what the bank would approve. Two financed cars, private everything. By the time the essentials are paid, the entire paycheck is already committed and there is nothing behind it. Zero. So when the transmission fails or the furnace dies or a medical bill lands, there is no room. The surprise doesn't get absorbed. It becomes debt. That is what broke actually is. Now, the $40,000 earner, smaller income, smaller life, smaller everything, except for one thing. There is a buffer sitting behind the essentials. So, when the same transmission fails, the same furnace dies, the same bill lands, the money is already there. The surprise gets absorbed. It's a bad week, not a bad year. Same emergency, completely different outcome, and income had nothing to do with it. This is the reframe the whole video rests on. If broke were an amount, the only fix would be more amount, earn more, and hope. But if broke is a structure, a measurable distance, then it is something you can engineer. You can measure the distance, you can close it, and once it's closed, it stays closed. That is the entire game. And almost nobody is playing it because almost nobody defines the word correctly. If broke is a distance, then somewhere in your finances, there is a line. Below it, every surprise turns into debt. Above it, the exact same surprise turns into an inconvenience you've forgotten by the end of the month. The problem is that the line is invisible. Nobody tells you where it is. So people wander around just beneath it for years, feeling broke on a good income, never knowing they are one small deposit away from the other side. Let me make the line visible because there are actually two of them. The first line is low, and it matters more than it looks. Most people don't fall into debt because of some catastrophe. They fall in because of one ordinary shock, a car repair, a vet bill, a busted appliance, somewhere around $1,000. That is the number that quietly starts more debt spirals than any layoff. So the first line is simply this, enough to cover the most common shock. Cross it, and the single most likely path into debt is closed. Not reduced, closed. The second line is the real one. This is essentials for a stretch of time enough that even a larger shock or a gap in income doesn't force your hand. For most people, that's a few months of the true cost of living. We're going to use 4 months as the target. 4 months of essentials is the point where you stop being fragile. Why 4 and not 2 or 10? Because 4 sits inside the range. Every sensible framework lands on 3 to 6 months. And it's the point that covers two different disasters at once. A single large shock and a short gap in income while you find your feet again. Less than that, and an income gap still sinks you. Much more than that, and you're spending years piling up idle cash instead of investing, which has its own cost. 4 is the balance point. Big enough to make you durable. Small enough that you can actually reach it. Both lines are numbers you can calculate to the dollar. Yours won't be the numbers I use on screen. Your essentials aren't mine. Your shock isn't mine. But the method is identical, and the answer is a specific figure, not a feeling. That is the difference between this and every Save More video you have ever skipped. Save more toward what? Toward the line, and the line has an address. Here's where it gets uncomfortable, and here's why the high earner is the broke one. You would assume a bigger income makes the line easier to reach.
More money in, more money to put behind you. But that is not what happens to most people because the line isn't fixed. It's built out of your essentials, and your essentials rise with your income almost automatically. Get a raise and the apartment gets nicer. The car payment appears. The lifestyle quietly expands to fill the new number. It feels like progress. What is actually happening is that your safety line is moving up faster than your savings are moving toward it. Watch it in the two figures. The modest earners' essentials are low, so 4 months of them is a target of around $8,800. Reachable, human-sized. The high earners' essentials are inflated, the big mortgage, the financed cars, so 4 months of them is around $26,000. His line sits 3 times higher than the low earners. Same rule applied to a bigger life produces a much bigger target. Watch it happen in real time. Say you land a raise of $2,000 a month, the thing you've been chasing for years. If even 1,200 of that quietly gets absorbed into a nicer place and a newer car, your essentials just rose by 1,200 a month, which means your 4 month line just rose by 4 times that, almost $5,000. You got a raise, and on the very same day, your safety line moved almost $5,000 further away. That is not a spending scandal. It's a normal, reasonable set of upgrades that anyone would make. And it is exactly why the raise didn't make you feel any safer. The line outran it. So the high earner isn't just failing to save, he is running toward a finish line that his own spending keeps pushing away from him. His income didn't buy safety. It bought a higher standard of essentials, which raised the very line he has to clear. That is the mechanism people miss when they assume the money itself was the problem. The money wasn't necessarily spent foolishly. It was spent in a way that moved the goalposts. More income made him look richer and left him further from the line. That is how you earn $140,000 a year and stay broke. So here's the move, just one. The day your income arrives, an automatic transfer sends a fixed slice into a separate high-yield account before you see it, before you can spend it, before your brain has a chance to allocate it to something else. You decide once. The system does it every week. After that, indefinitely. I want to be precise about why this is weekly and not daily, because it is not a gimmick. The reason discipline fails is that it demands a decision every single time. Save or spend, invest or wait. Every day you're asked, and every day the asking wears you down, and eventually you're too tired to choose. Well, a daily habit is more of exactly the thing that breaks people. Weekly is different. It's frequent enough to feel like real steady motion, but it runs on automation instead of willpower. A standing transfer, not a daily act of self-control. You are not trying to be disciplined 1,000 times. You're trying to be disciplined once when you set it up. How much? The clean answer is 10% of your income. The same 10% the sensible frameworks carve out for stability. On a take-home of $6,000 a month, that's $600, which comes to about $138 a week. Small enough to barely register, large enough, as you're about to see, to make broke impossible. Where does it go? Not into stocks. This money's job is not to grow. It is to be there. So it lives somewhere with 3 properties: instant access, zero volatility, and a small but real yield. A high-yield savings account is the natural home. As of now, many of them pay somewhere in the range of 4 to 5%, roughly keeping pace with inflation and quietly helping. But the yield is a bonus, not the point. The point is that when you need this money, it is there in full on the day you need it. No questions asked. Now, the part most videos skip, because it isn't exciting. I would rather earn the claim than sell it. So let me be straight about the assumptions. This works if you can find the 10%. For a lot of people, that's the whole problem. The 10% isn't lying around. If that's you, the money comes from the same place it always has to. Your 2 biggest fixed costs, housing and transportation. Those 2 line items sink more budgets than every coffee run in history combined. A slightly smaller place in the same neighborhood, a reliable used car instead of a financed new one. You don't have to gut your life. You have to get the 2 big numbers under control, because a small percentage of a budget you actually command beats a large percentage of one you don't. I'm also assuming your essentials stay roughly stable while you build. If they're climbing, the line climbs with them and you'll be chasing it, which is exactly the high earner's trap in slow motion. So, the discipline isn't only the transfer. It is holding your essentials still while the buffer catches up. Let the line sit while you close the distance, and be precise about what essentials even are, because this is where people quietly fool themselves. Essentials are the costs that don't stop if your income does. Housing, utilities, groceries, insurance, transportation to work, minimum debt payments. That's the list. It does not mean your streaming stack, your dining out, or the gym membership you're not using. When you size the line off your true essentials instead of your comfortable ones, two things happen at once. The target gets smaller, and it gets honest. A line built on inflated essentials is a line you'll never reach and never actually need it. And one rule that isn't optional: the day you use this money, and you will use it, that's what it is for. You refill it first before anything else, like a loan to yourself that gets repaid ahead of every want. The buffer only works if it's whole. A buffer you spent and never rebuilt is just a memory of safety. None of this is dramatic, that's the point. The unglamorous version is the one that survives contact with a real life. Now, put it on a timeline, because this is where the word impossible stops being a headline and becomes arithmetic. You start the transfer about $138 a week. Within roughly 7 weeks, call it a month and a half, Udori, you've crossed the first line. You now have enough to absorb the most common shock, the $1,000 surprise that starts most debt. Think about what just happened. The single most likely way you are going to fall into debt this year is now closed. 7 weeks in, you are already a structurally different person than you were at the start, and you have barely felt it. Then you keep going. At $600 a month, the 4-month line, $12,000 for our example viewer, arrives in about 20 months, under 2 years. And it arrives a little sooner than the raw math suggests, because the account is paying you along the way. Over that stretch, the yield quietly adds close to $400 you never deposited. That is the number on the thumbnail. And now you can see it's the conservative version, not the hopeful one. And before you tell me those are my numbers and not yours, here's the part that surprised me when I ran it. The time it takes has almost nothing to do with the size of your paycheck. It comes down to a single ratio: your essentials divided by your income. Do the algebra, and the timeline is just 40 times that ratio in months. If your essentials eat half your income, that's 40 times 1/2, 20 months. Whether you take home $2,000 a month or $8,000, the lean earner putting away $200 a month crosses the same finish line in the same 20 months as the one putting away $600, and it is exactly why the high earner is stuck. His essentials eat 78% of his take-home, so his ratio drags his timeline out past 30 months, no matter how big the number on his paycheck is. The paycheck cancels out. The ratio is the whole thing. Here's the moment it becomes impossible. Once you're above that line, watch what an emergency actually does. A $3,000 hit lands. You pay it from the buffer instantly. No card, no loan. You've dropped below the line. So the same transfer that built the buffer now refills it. And at $600 a month, you are back above the line in about 5 months. During those 5 months, you borrowed nothing and you sold nothing. The system absorbed a shock and repaired itself out of the same 10% that built it in the first place. That is the property that makes broke impossible. Not that emergencies stop happening. They never stop. It's that emergencies stop turning into debt. A shock hits, the buffer takes it, the buffer refills, you are whole again. It is self-healing. And a self-healing system doesn't spiral. That's the reveal. Broke isn't unlikely once you're above the line. It's structurally off the table. Let me show you the 2 disasters this quietly prevents, because they are the 2 ways ordinary people lose years of progress in a single bad month. The first is being forced to sell at the worst possible time. Say the market's down 30% and an emergency hits without a buffer. You have to raise cash by selling investments at the bottom. Sell $3,000 worth there, and you've handed away shares that would have recovered to more than $4,200 when the market came back. That single forced sale cost you close to $1,300 in recovery you will never see. The buffer means you never sell into a crash because you're pulling from stability instead. The market can do whatever it wants. Your emergency doesn't touch it. The second is the debt spiral itself. That same $3,000 emergency put on a card at around 24% and paid off over 2 years cost you roughly $800 in interest on top of the $3,000. And that's the disciplined version where you actually pay it off on schedule. The buffer skips all of it. Same emergency, 0 interest because you paid cash you already had. So step back to our 2 people 2 years on. The $40,000 earner ran the one move and is now permanently above the line. A place where emergencies are inconveniences and debt is something that happens to other people. The high earner, if nothing changed, is exactly where he started. A big income, a bigger line, and nothing behind it. He could get there too, but with his inflated essentials, his line is so much higher that even on his larger income, it would take him about 2.5 years, and only if he finally stopped letting his lifestyle climb. Same 2 years. One of them bought permanent safety, the other bought another year of looking rich. That is the whole difference between looking wealthy and being wealthy. One is about appearance, the other is about options. The room to take a hit, to say no, to make a decision that isn't dictated by this month's bills. The buffer buys options, and options, unlike a nicer car, don't depreciate.